Great.
Yes. Welcome, everyone, to the presentation of Lex Rosera, which is a work on transferring predictive models among different contexts, such as languages, jurisdictions, and legal domains. As you can see, this work is a joint effort of a sizable team of researchers in machine learning, computer science, and law, coming from many different institutions. And as I already said, this presentation will be delivered by Hannes and myself. So in this work, we investigate the task of segmenting adjudicatory decisions into parts, such as the background of the case, the analysis, or its outcome. We specifically identify the task that is general and fits different contexts. By that, I mean different types of decisions from different legal domains, even countries and legal systems, which also means the decisions can be in different languages. We use this task to evaluate the effectiveness of pre-trained multilingual embeddings to transfer a trained machine learning model across such contexts. We release the task type schema definition, the annotated dataset, as well as all the code we used in our experiments to the public.
So why are we doing this? Well, I think what you often see in machine learning is that the model is trained and evaluated on data with the same distribution. So there's some data set that is assembled, such as from legal cases, often, for example, from the same jurisdiction or in the same language. This is then split into a training and a test portion. And the training portion is used to train the model, and the testing portion is used to evaluate the performance of the model. But this doesn't always tell us about how well the model will generalize. What happens if we give it a new unseen data set? Because the model might have learned some specific particularity of the data set it was trained on that will still work well when applied against this testing model, testing data set, but when it is used in practice, perhaps the data looks different and the model might just work very badly on this new data. So here we investigate whether it is possible to build models that generalize between different contexts. And as Jaromir mentioned, by context we mean different languages, different jurisdictions, and different legal domains. So we identify the task that is relevant across many such contexts. And the task that we chose was to segment legal decisions into different portions. First, the segment of the background, where the facts are introduced. Then the analysis, where a judge would discuss these facts and apply legal rules. And finally, the outcome, where it states the results of this. And here you can see a human annotated decision from the Czech Republic that has been annotated with these segments. But this kind of type schema works across many different contexts. So here, for example, is a decision of employment dispute from the United States that has also been annotated by a human with these same categories. So what we can do now is that we can take data from one context, train a model with this, and then evaluate how well it performs on data from another context. So for example, what we've done here is that we've taken a model that is trained exclusively on data from the Czech Republic. And then we've used that model to segment this decision from the United States. And here you see the results of this. So this is purely generated by a machine, these segments, that has never before seen any decision in English, and has never before seen a decision in labor law, but rather has been trained on decisions from the Czech Republic from various different courts. And as you can see, it still works pretty well. And I think this is pretty remarkable. What we're really doing here is that we train a model on data from the Czech Republic, and then we evaluate it against data from the United States that is never seen before, fully unseen data. But despite this, we achieve a weighted F1 score of 0.86. So that is one of the things we evaluate here. But we also look at what happens if we pool multiple such data sets together. So what if we add additional context to data from the Czech Republic and evaluate that against data from the United States? And what happens if we use all of our data set as a pool for training? Will that and include also data from the target context, so the United States in this case, will that further improve performance? I think this could have pretty interesting implications here. First, it could allow the creation of really robust and generalizable models. That is, models that you could deploy in a real-world scenario, and it would work across many data from with different distributions, different languages, and from different contexts. It could also allow the rapid adaptation of models to new contexts. You could start with a model that has already been trained and that works pretty well on your target context, and then fine-tune it a bit to make it work really well. That's probably much quicker than training it from scratch. And finally, it enables this international collaboration of researchers, since researchers can annotate their own data set and contribute to a common pool that is then useful to all the different researchers across many different countries.
All right, let us speak about the data set. So as already mentioned, the first step in creating the data set was a definition of the type schema. This definition is expressed in detailed annotation guidelines, and of course, these are also available in the project repository. The type schema includes types such as out of scope. So these are parts outside of the main document body. For example, metadata and editorial content, maybe endnotes, appendices, and such. Also headings. These are fairly straightforward. So for the purposes of our experiments here, we removed the out-of-scope content and headings, which only left us with background, analysis, and outcome. Background is the part where the court describes procedural history, relevant facts of the case, and so on. Analysis is the section that contains reasoning of the court, issue, maybe applicable law, and finally, outcome are the few sentences stating how the case was decided. It is worth mentioning that by removing headings from the texts, we have made this task more difficult. Right? There are some domains where headings are suggestive about the beginning of a certain part. However, this is not a general rule. And what we wanted to do is to make sure that the models we train will focus on the meaning of the text rather than on superficial cues, such as the presence of a heading. Reliance on such cues would have almost certainly resulted in models that are very brittle and would prevent a successful transfer among different contexts. Now, after learning the types definition and participating in the training, the authors split into 8 teams, where the goal of each team was to assemble a dataset of approximately 100 documents. The authors could create such dataset in whatever way they wanted. The only constraint really was that each sub-dataset needs to contain decision documents that are in the same language. The aim was to obtain collections of documents that would be quite different when compared to each other. We needed this in order to investigate the transfer capabilities of the multilingual embeddings. To give you a more precise idea of the differences among those subsets, let us look at some of them more closely. First of all, it's apparent that they come from different countries and the documents are very often written in different languages. For example, the German subset is a stratified sample from the federal jurisprudence database spanning all federal courts, such as civil, criminal, labor, administrative, and many more types of court. On the other hand, one of the USA subsets is a very specialized selection of federal district court decisions in employment law, mentioning the term motion for summary judgment, employee, and independent contractor. So a very, very narrowly specified domain. Overall, the dataset consists of 807 cases coming from 7 different countries that are written in 6 different languages. There are almost 90,000 sentences annotated with one of the types from the schema presented earlier. As already mentioned, the dataset, including the type schema definition, is available in a publicly accessible repository. To give you a bit more insight into the data we operate on in this work, let us look at this graph. First of all, notice that we did not use the out-of-scope and heading sentences in our experiments here. This reduces the size of the dataset from around 90,000 sentences to roughly 75,000. It is very apparent that there are some considerable differences among the parts of the dataset. For example, the French decisions are quite short when compared to others. But there are also some shared similarities. For all the datasets, it holds that the analysis sentences are the most numerous, followed by the background sentences. Finally, the outcome sentences are the most rare. Except the French subset, the number of outcome sentences is considerably lower than the number of sentences of the other 2 types. That is for the dataset, and let us move on to the models.
Right, so to perform this task of segmenting the decisions into different sections, we need to develop a machine learning model. And this is a high-level overview of how that model looks.
Hannes, I'm sorry, just to alert you, you have 4 more minutes to finish this presentation, and so we can open the questions, okay? Just so you know.
We started late, and it's
Okay, so let's push more 7 minutes, okay?
okay.
So at the bottom here, you see the case that is, first of all, split into different sentences. And each of these sentences using tools such as Spacey. And each of these sentences is then fed through an embedding model that is called LASER, language agnostic sentence representations, that embeds these sentences into an embedding space, a vector of 1024 dimensions. And the special thing about this representation is that it is language agnostic. So these embeddings, if the semantic content of the sentence is similar, they will be in a similar embedding space, close to each other, no matter the language. This is then fed to a gated recurrent unit bidirectional network, that then for each sentence outputs a label, such as the background, the analysis, and the outcome. And this is a bidirectional model. So in making these predictions, this model has access to the previous and also the following sentences and their embeddings. So then performed a number of experiments. We evaluated 3 different hypotheses, and what they differ in is what is used as training data, whether it is single or multiple data sets. And we always compare them against a baseline to make sure that the results are strong. And then we evaluate this by looking at an F1 score, and we do this, that is a harmonic mean between precision and recall. And we do this for 10 k-fold splits for each experiment to make sure that the results are regular. So let's start with the first hypothesis, that is the out-context experiment. So the question that we want to examine here is, can a model trained in a single context generalize to other contexts? So it's possible that a model can learn from one language or jurisdiction and so on, and be successfully applied in another context. So we saw this before, where we use one single context as training data, and then we test it against another context. And we move through the different contexts this way. First Czech Republic, and then France, and so on. And once we've done all of these, we will use a different context for training, such as the Czech Republic, and test this against another data set. And we compare this against a baseline of stratified random prediction, and that outputs a random prediction based on the distribution of the data. And here you can see the results. So to the left here is the context this is trained on, and to the right is the average F1 score, and we compare it against the rest of the data sets. So the baseline gets an F1 score of about 0.51. And all of our models actually gain an F1 score that's quite higher than this, between 0.60 and 0.70, and sometimes higher. So this seems to be able to learn something. And we've also seen that if data sets are similar, it seems to perform better, such as Canada and the United States. And we'll get back to this later, why this might be the case. And even the outcome section, that is much rarer than the other sections, is sometimes works to predict using this model. So from this, I think you can take away that the models are able to transfer knowledge between different contexts, despite having never seen this before and being completely different languages or domains. So next, let's look at the H2 experiment, the pooled out context experiment. So here, the question is, what if we add additional context to the training pool? Does this increase robustness? As in, does it make the performance better when applied on unseen data sets? So whereas before, we use a single context for training and try it against a target data set. Now we use this single context plus the other contexts that are not part of, that are not the target data set, and see how well this model performs. And then we move on. So for example, here we take France, and then we exclude this from the training data and continue prediction. And as a baseline here, we use the best performing out context model per context. And I want to highlight that this is quite a competitive baseline, since as I mentioned before, some data sets are much closer together. For example, Canada and the United States perform very well across each other. And that means, of course, that if a model is trained on Canada, this will be the best performing out-context model per context for the United States, whereas our model has many more different data sets that it needs to abstract from and learn this to apply to this new context. And here you can see the results. So this row is for the baseline, and here we have our model. And as you can see, in 7 out of 8 cases, our model matches or improves on this baseline. And the results, as you can see, are pretty high, usually over 0.80 and sometimes even over 0.90. And remember, this is on really unseen data. So this is something that could potentially be useful when applied in practice and being used in a completely previously unseen domain. So I think from this we can take away that training on a pool of data sets leads to more robust models, and it leads to better adaptation to unseen contexts. And finally, we have the pooled within context experiment. So what's happening here, that the question is, does combining in-context data with out-context data improve performance? So whereas before we excluded this training data, now we add this data as well. So we use all the different contexts for training and then evaluate it against a single test context. Of course, we don't use the same data. We use different folds here so that it's still never seen the testing data, but it has seen data from that context. And then we move through to use this to predict the different target contexts. And as baseline here, we use in-context models. And so that is a model that has only been trained on the target context. And again, I want to highlight that this is a super competitive baseline. This is seeing the data that will be by far the most similar to the target context. And this means that the model trained on only this data should have a really good opportunity to learn the distribution there and to do that prediction. Whereas our model, of course, has 8 different data sets that it needs to learn from and extract from. So it is quite difficult to get this baseline. But despite this, in 6 out of 8 cases, our model outperforms this baseline. And again, the results are very high, often over 0.80 and often even over 0.90. So I think from this we can take away that training on in-context data pooled with out-context data does improve performance when compared against this single models trained on a single target context. So the model does seem to be able somehow to abstract from these different data sets and take the lessons to build a stronger model.
All right, let us look at some of the findings more closely. So the results from testing hypothesis 1 and hypothesis 2 strongly suggest that multilingual embeddings focus on the semantics of the sentences rather than superficial linguistic features. This is extremely important for a work like this one. It is very important that the models focus on the semantics and avoid fitting the context-specific idiosyncrasies, even though they could be useful within that context. Moving on, we observed that some of the contexts appear to be more related amongst themselves than to other contexts. In order to get some additional insight into this phenomenon, we projected full documents into a shared semantic space. Using PCA to reduce the dimensionality to just 2, we obtained this visualization where each dot represents a single document. The color encodes membership of a document in a specific context. You can see that both the USA subsets occupy virtually the same semantic space. This makes a lot of sense if you consider that the documents are written in the same language, they come from the same tradition. On top of that, both subsets are focused on employment law. German subset occupies the space in the middle, and it also appears to be a bit more dispersed than the other ones. This is likely due to the fact that it is the most general dataset, not focusing on a specific topic. Of course, this is expected, and it provides grounds for future work. In this work, we did not factor the context relatedness in our experiments at all. Another interesting observation relates to structural differences in the documents. We noticed that German and Polish models struggle in predicting the outcomes for other subsets and the other way around. This is explained by structural differences in the documents. Whereas the German and Polish documents report the outcomes that are depicted in green at the beginning of the decisions, the documents from other subsets tend to place these towards the end. However, it is promising that the models that have access to data with both these patterns were able to acquire them both and apply them rather successfully. To conclude, we observed that the models utilizing multilingual embeddings manifested good generalization capabilities. It appears that pooling multiple contexts together results in improved robustness and performance of the models, and it helps even when in-domain data is available. It was an extremely rewarding experience to identify a task that was relevant for researchers with different interests and was applicable in wildly different contexts. And we are really looking forward to what comes next and how the dataset and the code we released is going to be used by this community. And of course, we also have some ideas of our own. While the dataset is sizable, it would certainly benefit from expanding it with more documents from more different contexts. We use the data in the most straightforward way here to segment the documents into parts with different functions. However, this could be a useful step in many applications focused on, for example, information retrieval or summarization. In our experiments, we simply pull the data from different contexts together. Using more sophisticated approaches would be a reasonable way how to improve on this work. Finally, we also anticipate that resources resulting from this type of work could be useful for gaining insights into differences and similarities among the different contexts, akin to the structural analysis of the documents performed here. All right, that's all from us, and we are looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Jaromir. Thank you, Hans. I'm sorry again for the delay. I really liked your presentation. Actually, people have 5 minutes to ask some questions, but I have one. I like to know about regarding the transference of these models on arbitral proceedings. Can we apply or use this model itself in such proceedings?
I mean, the current model was trained on judicial proceeding from a really wide variety, and there's some judgments in there from courts, there's some tribunals and so on. So it is really a wide range of data. I think this does suggest that this could be something that could be useful across such data as well. And if you look at the paper, it seems that even though there are completely different instances involved, different types of instances, it does seem to generalize quite well. So if this kind of schema does make sense to apply on that kind of data, I think it's definitely something that would be feasible. And otherwise, I mean, as you mentioned, this is just one type of schema, but there could certainly be others that could be very useful, no matter what type of data we're looking at.
To specify this answer a little bit further, so the multilingual embeddings that we use, they support almost 200 languages, and they are supposed to work to a certain extent even on languages that they were not trained on if the languages come from the same family as the languages that this was trained on. So theoretically, we could take document in almost any reasonable language and applied it. And if the task makes sense, meaning that it's a judicial document that kind of follows this similar structure that we have here, it would be applicable there. Very
well, very clever. Thank you. We have another question. Can you explain embeddings that are language agnostic? Is heterogeneous data being homogenized, which could explain transfer learning?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think that's one of the key things here about this model is really the idea that it does the translation for us, or we don't even have to care about translation, because what it does is it takes these sentences, no matter the language, and it encodes this into this shared semantic space. And in this space, and we've seen this work really well, where like two sentences that are, say, in Czech or in German or in English, they will always end up very closely if the meaning behind them is very similar. I think that's one of the really powerful methods of this new deep learning paradigm, where we can download a model like this that has been pre-trained on almost 100 languages and apply this on our own data and get something that is able to generalize so well across different languages.
Yeah, and again, I mean, just to make the point, so the translation does not really happen. Like you supply the sentence in almost any language, the sentence is projected onto a vector, and sentences coming from different languages, if the meaning is close, the vectors will also be close. That's how this works.
Okay. We have one last question. Do you think the results could be improved when using your model as an ensemble with another model that relies on the structural information like headlinks?
I mean, definitely, there is a lot of space for improvement. In our work, we did not really drive towards like the best possible performance. Our goal really was to evaluate the capabilities of the multilingual embeddings to see if this really works in a legal context in the particular task that we were evaluating. But what is being suggested here is definitely one of the very promising paths towards improving the performance, and we also see many other paths.
And the data is there, so if someone wants to do this, we really encourage people to try this out and see how that would work. It would be really interesting.
For now, I have two questions from the audience. The first one is from Jack Conrad, and he asked the following question. Could you address the difficulty of the tasks, given the trade-off between more general training data and the ability to the models to tackle more difficult tasks? Is this a sacrifice you wish to make?
Thank you. This is a fantastic question. So obviously there is this trade-off between I would rather say specificity than difficulty of the task, and the generality of the task, right? So in order for this type of approach being applicable, the more general task, the better, right? Because then you get the opportunity to use more context, and you don't really need to be worried too much about the specifics, right? But very often, what the researcher would be interested in might be something where they deal with a domain that just has its peculiarities, and this is what they are interested in, right? And in this case, it might not be completely appropriate to necessarily try to take this path. However, still, that task may have some general traits, and maybe they might be able to use this approach to maybe tackle parts of that task, to maybe save themselves from some data collection that they would have to do, and maybe they can just focus on the other parts that are just peculiar to that specific domain.
I also want to highlight here that in the data set that we released, there are in fact many more labels than we used here. So we also have headings, we have introductory summary for some cases, and so on. So I think even here there will be many more tasks to explore, and we're looking forward to do this, but also encourage others to look into this.
Thank you. The following question from Marta Costa is the following. Do you think your research conclusions can encourage international cooperation among researchers?
Thank you. That's another really good question. And I really think it can. So I think usually the way it works in AI and law is that researchers will build some data set that's focused on a particular domain in a particular language, which works really well for them. But of course, if others want to reproduce the research in their own domain, they might have to annotate some use cases so that it generalizes. But I think here we've devised this task that is a task that makes sense in a lot of different domains in a lot of different countries, where we use the 8 different contexts. And then we also show that the model behind it is able to abstract away from these particular contexts and learn some general idea of this task that is domain independent. I think this is super promising for this kind of international collaboration, since the way it could work is that researchers annotate their data sets still, the one they're interested in, the one they're working on in a particular domain. But then they can also share this with other researchers. And it's a kind of win-win situation, because by sharing this data set, the other researchers can train a model that is general, and that performs better, in fact, than if they use only their own data set. And of course, the original researcher can also take the data sets from the other and add this to the model. And not just that will this make their model probably stronger, and it will also make it much more robust, meaning that you can, instead of only being able to apply this model in their own domain, they can suddenly use this model that they built and apply it to other languages and other domains, which could be really important if you want to build a model that you then share and use in the real world and apply to different languages. So I do think that that's a very exciting aspect here, and we're really looking forward to explore that aspect.
Thank you so much. Is there any further points you'd like to address, any further comments?
Yeah, I guess that I would just really like to thank the whole team, because that is what I think is really unique about this work, that such a large team of researchers with completely different backgrounds, like from law, computer science, were able to come together and really put together this resource that is now available there for everyone. And I would really like to invite the whole community to look into that resource and start playing with that. We don't really keep anything for ourselves. We have even published, so big parts of the data sets are double annotated. So we have even published the annotations from both the annotators. So there is even potential for some sort of a research on how to deal with potentially conflicting labels and so on. So please look at it and play with it.